I was obsessed with it. And so I tried to run against Jeff Kennett in his own seat in Burwood at the 1999 state election, but I discovered that I was still on the electoral roll in Sydney. So I was ineligible to run and I lost my job. So I then published the website jeff.com, which ended up getting more traffic than the Labor Party's website during the last 2 weeks of the campaign. It got 115,000 page views in 2 weeks and was credited in some circles with contributing to Jeff's defeat. And of course, it was difficult to get a mainstream job back then. So I then started crikey.com with the slogan of bringing down governments since September 1999. And to help promote Crikey, because the media would often write me out of the story, because I often criticised the Murdochs, they just banned me. It was just total oxygen denial strategy. Fairfax didn't like me. So I started going to AGMs and asking questions, and as a way of promoting Crikey and also continuing on what I'd done for the Telegraph. And then I started running for boards because I found everyone was writing me out of the story, and running for a board is an event. It causes an election, whereas everything else is just words. So I started running for boards because no one had ever done it before. The Directors Club were just always, put back in with 96% on average with no one contesting. Whereas in political elections, there's always a big contest. So I sort of cottoned on to the running for boards as a tactic to help promote Crikey, because if I run for a board of the AMP or Commonwealth Bank, they've got 800,000 shareholders, that they have to send your message to 800,000 people. Stephen Mayne is the publisher of crikey.com.au. So it was great free marketing paid for by the companies in the early days of Crikey, shortly after 2000. And so that's basically how I got in. I went from being a journalist to an activist. That was I jumped out of journalism to get into politics. I probably wanted to be a Liberal MP. I love my politics. I'm still a PPP, a poorly paid part-time politician at the moment in the suburbs. I do love my politics, but no major party will have me because I speak truth to power, and I'm too much of an independent spirit, I guess. And so I finished up, we sold Crikey for $1 million after 5 years. It was a tough journey. We lost our house in a defamation struggle on the way through. We moved house 5 times in 2.5 years whilst we were having 3 kids. So it was a hell of a struggle, but we eventually got out with a good payday. And since then, I've basically been freelance journalism, sometimes councillor, elected, running for office, shareholder activism, just generally being a free spirit. And tonight I'm going to take you through a few slides which explains some of the detail of what's happened and why. So I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to go. Is that sharing?
Not yet.
Not yet? Okay, hang on. I'm just going to go share.
Do you need to run your cursor to the top to bring up the button?
How's that? Go. Okay, now I'll just get onto slideshow from the beginning. All right, so well, you know that bit. So I do call myself Australia's biggest election loser. So I've lost 9 political elections and 54 public company elections, and I've had about $500 billion worth of stock voted against me over the last 21 years. I have made a few enemies along the way. Here's a few colourful quotes of what people have said about me at different times. Kerry Packer, I don't know why he was so upset. I just asked him if he was losing money in Hoyts, which he had just bought. Rupert Murdoch said, "You're free to fire me anytime, Mr. Mayne." All I asked was, does he have an employment contract at the annual meeting? Andrew Bolt, I was filling in for John Fane, and Andrew Bolt actually physically stormed the studio and declared that the ABC was disgraced by my presence because I wouldn't give him a right of reply to something Joan Kerner and I had been criticising him when she was on the Conversation Hour. Yeah, so anyway, there's a few more, but I'm not that popular. So when I got pushed off the stage at the Walkleys in 2006, I don't know if some of you remember that, Glenn Milne pushed me off the stage on live television. He claimed he got 300 emails of congratulations at the time. So it must have been a few of these billionaires, I suspect. But Anyway, so that's the full list of my board tilts. As you can see, in 2000, no one had worked out how to actually vote against anything. So in my first 5 tilts in 2000, I got massive votes. I almost got elected to Woolworths, and NRMA got 46%, and Commonwealth Bank 40%. So they only ever knew how to donkey vote down the page. They just never, this concept of actually voting against something was just foreign to the shareholders. So then they worked out they don't want this nutter on their board. So as you can see, my votes progressively got lower. But that's, I mean, the tilts, they range. Like, I think I've made good progress with capital raisings. So I've run for quite a few boards after they've done an unfair capital raising that's ripped off retail shareholders. So, I mean, a good example was, I remember Westfield one time, they did a $3 billion placement. And I wrote to them and I said, well, if you don't do a share purchase plan for the small shareholders, I'm going to run for your board at the AGM. And so they then immediately, 3 days later, they announced a share purchase plan to stop me from running for their board. So I have found you can get quite a bit of leverage. So early on, I think I single-handedly helped get rid of cash for comment. Remember that controversy where the shock jocks were getting paid by public companies to not criticize, like Alan Jones and John Laws, to not criticise them or to say nice things about them. So I ran for Commonwealth Bank, NRMA, a couple of others on a platform of stop paying Alan Jones. And I think that's why Alan Jones said I don't deserve a place in society, because I cost him quite a bit of money by shaming people who were giving him backhanders into stop doing it, because they were suddenly getting this crazy guy run for their board and talking about it when they thought they were buying themselves good publicity. They were buying themselves bad publicity. So they all cancelled their contracts, which was quite handy. I mean, I like my David Jones one, was a bit of fun. I said that all shareholders should get the same 35% shopping discount that the directors get. So that was a bit of fun. Quite a few times they censor your platform. If you say something particularly controversial, they censor it. So we do need an independent electoral body to run corporate elections, because it's not a secret ballot. They can see how every shareholder votes. They see all that information ahead of me. And for a while there, before Julia Gillard changed the law in 2010, boards used to declare, they used to have flexibility to say what the maximum size of the board was. So they would always say it was one less than having me on. And so that meant that I would have to get 100% to get elected, because I had to beat the least popular director. And the average director gets 96%. But when you consider back then that the chairman used to get undirected proxies averaging of 5 to 10%. I worked out that in 10 of these 54 tilts, if I had got 100% of the vote in favour, I still would have lost, because the chairman would have used the undirected proxies from the shareholder who just ticks the box and sends it back to the company, and that defaults to the chair. He would have used the undirected proxies to get me down to 94, and that would have been not as popular as Mr. 97 and Mr. 98. So I would have been unsuccessful, having got 100% of the vote in favour. So that's one of the rorts, and thankfully Julia Gillard ended that rort. And that was a rort we only discovered because I started running for boards, because no one had ever done this before, and worked out that these boards had all these entrenchment techniques, such as being able to manipulate the board size and then declare there was no room in the inn for the outsider trying to break into their club. These are the political contests over the years. So I was pretty proud of when I ran against, when Jeff Kennett retired from Parliament, I said, well, I'll run this time, because he's now out. He's resigning because he lost. So I ran in his seat, and I got 6.7% and beat the Green, which was quite good. In 2010, I almost got elected to the upper house with 1% of the vote. I did one of those sneaky preference deals where I ran earlier in the Senate, and I said to Richard Di Natale and Steve Fielding, I'll give you 50% of my first preferences each if the Greens and Family First will give me a first preference in the Victorian upper house election later in the year. So I had all these great preference deals, but I only got 1%. If I'd got 1.3%, I would have had the balance of power in the Victorian upper house. So what might have been there. But my best one was City of Melbourne when I won. I got 6% of the vote, didn't spend $1, and I had the balance of power for 4 years and just had a great time there. It was a Camelot council. got lots of good things done. We had 4 lefties, 5 on the Doyle team, and 2 of us who had the balance of power, and that was a really good experience. And I was very happy with my vote last year at Manningham. 41% was the most solid vote I've ever had, because usually I poll pretty poorly. When I ran against Peter Costello in Higgins in 2007, it was on a platform of better regulate the banks. The banks are ripping everyone off. We've got the world's most lucrative banking system, and also get rid of the pokies. So, probably 12 years later, banking became an issue, but back then no one was talking about it, and I only got 2% in that election. So, if I can summarise, my sort of, this is the best summary I can come up with for what I sort of argue for. I'm ultimately a transparency campaigner. As a journalist, your job is to disclose information to the public, factual information, and hold the powerful to account. So I really am a disclosure junkie. So at City of Melbourne, I was basically an embedded journalist, telling the world all the secrets of Town Hall. And so I'm a big believer in that. And the 4 things I think for any institution, country, board to work is you've got to have these 4 things. You've got to have great, honest, capable, inspiring leaders. You've got to have them working within a well-designed system which has the right incentives. You've got to have accurate information on the leaders and the system performance. And then you've got to have the ability to change the leadership and change the system design as merited by the factual information before you. And the best example of that is a non-violent change of government, where the press reports that the government's tired and corrupt, the system allows for a non-violent fair election, and the leadership is changed. And it's amazing how many organisations, institutions, countries struggle with that basic systemic design, leadership, management, disclosure, transparency, accountability question. These are the Manningham reforms that got done in 2008, 2012. So we were the first council in Australia to do our full executive pay disclosure, similar to public companies where we had the top 5 pay, including their contract length. We revealed the full lease register of every lease we have over every park with every footy club, introduced public questions, audio of council meetings on the website, council expenses exposed, and a full 10-year capital works planning project by project. No council ever done that before. At City of Melbourne, I joined there in 2012, and in the 4-year plan, we vowed the following: to make City of Melbourne aspires to increase public disclosure and access to information to become one of the most transparent councils in Australia. So far more reforms at City of Melbourne when I was able to leverage the balance of power position that I had, and I put up 52 notices of motion in 4 years, and that was able to deliver a whole bunch of reforms, from audio council meetings on the website, unscripted public questions 4 times a month, all tenders done in public rather than open, unless very sensitive. Again, disclosure of CEO pay and senior director pay. We even in 2016 ran the first council voluntary political donations register. We partnered with The Age, and we got all the candidates to reveal their donations 3 times during the campaign, all totally voluntary, because there was no law requiring that. So yeah, it was a good example of, haven't just been an activist. There have been times when I have got elected, and you can actually live the dream of telling the public what's going on. Your journalistic instinct to disclose, and hopefully, for the public interest to lift the veil off the secrets of government, which really should be as transparent as possible because they're all owned and accountable to the public. So the AGM side of things, I basically worked out that, journalism was great. You could ring anyone up, but they didn't have to ring you back. They didn't have to take your call. So if you go to the AGM, they can't stop you asking questions. So I've asked questions at 460 AGMs since 1998. So it's an average of 20 a year, or 1 every 17 days for the last 23 years. So I'm a bit long in the tooth when it comes to the AGMs, but I'm quite efficient at it now. I can. My son called today. I didn't do any research. I just logged on half an hour into the meeting, started looking up stuff, and ended up asking 16 questions, because you've got the templates of sort of questions you can ask, and then you've got a bit of core knowledge to start with, and then a few things come out during the meeting. You look up the bios of the directors, you throw in a couple of things about their other board seats, and by the end of it, you've added an hour to the meeting, and it's all been good fun. So I started off with, the biggest year I had was 2008, post the GFC, when I launched the Mayne report, because I sold Crikey in 2005 and then launched the Mayne report in 2007. And then the 42 in 2000 was all about promoting Crikey. So that was, and then last year was my busiest year in a decade with 27. That was because of the online AGMs. And I'm aiming to crack 50 this year because online is so easy. And News Corp and the Murdochs have been my most followed company. I've had 5 trips to America to annoy Rupert over there. And then Macquarie 13 times, including their various listed funds. I came up with their nickname Millionaires Factory back in the day. They never paid me for that. Channel 7, Kerry Stokes, 9 times AMP, and then Fairfax and Channel 9. So I've got a few favourites, but this year I'm sort of having an approach of trying to tick a few boxes of companies I haven't been to before. So I'm buying shares in a few new ones. I want to sort of get to know new companies and also any new billionaires. I find the billionaire thing is the most fun thing of all because they're just so used to everyone revering them. And to actually just get up there and ask a few sharp questions of a billionaire is a lot of fun. And they tend to be the rudest, most aggressive, the Jerry Harveys of the world and the Solomon Lewis. Kerry Stokes is the only bloke who's ever called security on me at an AGM just for asking questions. Rupert Murdoch has these ridiculous meeting procedures whenever I turn up, which limits shareholders to 2 questions for the whole meeting of 1 minute each. So I've flown over from Melbourne to Los Angeles to be told at a 23-minute AGM, I'm allowed to ask 2 questions, 1 minute each. And this is the guy who lectures everyone else about free speech and transparency and accountability, and he's appalling in the way he runs his company. He's got a gerrymander that would make Sir Joby Olkie-Peterson blush, where 70% of the shares on issue don't get a vote. He hides behind poison pills. Murdoch men have taken $1.5 billion in salary from public companies in the last 22 years. It's basically been theft by boards that they've stacked with their compliant directors because they've got 40% of the votes but only 14% of the shares. So yeah, the instinct is just to sort of go after the dodgy players and try and get them to behave better. So I love the Australian governance model. I'll get to that in a tick. I'll just say, why do this? It's the AGM is the one day of the year that the board can't hide. The quality of the debate is traditionally pretty poor. I mean, the ASA does a pretty good job, but the institutions don't turn up, the analysts don't turn up, the fund managers don't turn up, the journalists are not allowed to ask questions. So you literally are relying on the ma and pa shareholder and it's just an information asymmetry between the board and the ordinary run-of-the-mill shareholder who can devote 3 hours of their day to turn up to an AGM at 11 a.m. in the city. So you don't get it. It's largely retirees. A lot of us are out there for the nice lunch. And the quality of the debate is often not good and can be quite tiresome. So that's why I got into it, because I thought, I can lift the standard here and get a few good stories along the way. So there is an element of education and entertainment for the attendees. I do try and make it so that the shareholder will come up afterwards and say, thank you for coming, you made that more interesting. So I basically sit back and say nothing and hope that everyone else will ask all the questions. But if no one gets up, then I'll get up and ask a few. And I always love it when James Packer at Crown, these boards, they never work out that to neutralise me, you've got to create your own Dorothy Dixes. You've got to create your own mates who pad out the questions and ask lots of questions and also start heckling me and tell me to sit down, we've had enough of this bloke. But he never does it. James Packer never did it. So every year he'd get up and he'd read this he'd confiscate your mobile phone, he'd take your briefcase off you, he'd read out this rigorous, no one can ask more than 2 questions, go back to the end of the queue after your 2 questions. So I'd get up and ask for 2 questions. I'd look around and say, well, there's no one in the queue, Chair. And then I'd ask 10 in a row. And it would just be me and James for half an hour, half the time. And so, yeah, he won't ever speak to me any other time. But it's a really good opportunity. And also, it's very influential because the entire board is there, the entire management team is there, and it will often generate media. So there was one time I went to the NRMA AGM and I got up and I said, why are you guys in the reinsurance business? You should get out of reinsurance. It's too risky. And this generated a negative headline in the Sydney Morning Herald the next day: NRMA under pressure over reinsurance business. Now, one of the executives told me later that this triggered the decision by the board to get out of reinsurance, and they sold the business a couple of months before September 11. And they calculated that saved them $300 million. And they wouldn't have got out of reinsurance but for it being brought to a head by the negative media and negative questions. So I never got a commission for that either. But, you can be influential because they often won't do things because, someone mentioned that at the AGM last year. We shouldn't do that because it might come up at the AGM. So these directors, they're all hidden away. They have no other exposure during the year to the public. So they really pay attention at the AGM because the rest of the time, all the public-facing stuff is done by the executives. So the board, the ordinary directors, unlike us local government councillors, they don't have their name and email, their phone number and their email address on the website. BHP shareholders can ring up the BHP directors and chat. They're all just hidden away, going to board meetings and voting on stuff. So they really pay attention to the AGM. So that's why it's really I think it's a good thing to do. Because if you don't want an AGM to be boring and no one asks any questions, what's the point? What is the point of it? And that too often the AGM is me and the ASA getting up and no one else. So attendance numbers have fallen in recent years, which has been a shame. So I want to talk about the online AGM, which I actually love because I must have spent over $100,000 on travel over the last 23 years. And, 5 trips to America. Now I can just annoy Rupert Murdoch typing a few things into the computer from Templestowe at the online AGM, although he only asked 2 of my 7 questions last year. So even on the online format, he's a dodgy accountability dodging operator. The online AGM, it saves you travel and time. You can also get through so many more questions because the questions are written and you can't waffle in a written question. So they get read out by the company and then the company answers it. So today at Suncorp, or even yesterday at AGL is Australia's biggest carbon polluter. Their AGM went for 2 hours and 55 minutes. I reckon they answered more than 100 questions at that. You really rattle through it. So it's so much more efficient. And you can clock in and clock off. You don't have to sort of stay in the room. You can have your lunch while you're watching it. So I love the online AGM. And you can go to multiple meetings at once because what happens is they open up the questions box an hour before the meeting. So I just cut and paste all my questions into the questions box and then I'll go off to another meeting and I'll go back and listen to the other one later. You don't even have to watch it live. You just pump your questions in. So you're almost just like a barrister. You just, you're given a brief, you go along, you fire in a few questions. The negative of the online AGM is that you can be censored. So Rio Tinto didn't ask any of my 9 questions this year because they had a hybrid AGM and they allowed the people in the room in Perth to dominate and they really shut out us online people. So that's why I almost prefer online only, because if they do a hybrid with a physical meeting and online, the physical, you'll still get the waffle, and they can dominate and then they don't really give the online much of a go. So I'd almost prefer online only to a hybrid. The biggest thing you lose from the online AGM is you can't do the barrister style cross-examination. You can't do the follow-up. You can't see the whites of the eyes. You can't chat to the directors beforehand and afterwards. You can't talk to the press that are at the meeting and you can't socialise and share notes with the other shareholders. So it's just everyone for themselves from a shareholder point of view. Although occasionally you can text people, say, good question, or can you ask this? But it's much better to be sitting with people at the meeting. And sometimes the shareholders aren't named. So at Metcash last week, that's the IGA parent company. That's the last month. They just didn't even say who the shareholder was. So and it was quite funny. I'll tell you a funny Harvey Norman story. So he's an absolute shocker. So I ran for his board in 2019 and he was an absolute disgrace the way he insulted me. He asked me if I was a sexual predator at the meeting. It was just extraordinary. Anyway, I got lots of media and the board said, you were crazy, Jerry. You just got to calm down. And so at last year's online AGM, they obviously come up with a plan to not name the shareholder. So they just said, a shareholder asked. This suited me perfectly. So I got to question 22 and Jerry finally says, is that Stephen Mayne asking every single question? And so I had to say, yes, that's it, no more. But because they didn't name them, I was able to fire off 22 questions, and Jerry was getting more and more annoyed at these continuing negative, harping, pointed, well-researched questions. Well-researched because I got some help from the proxy advisors who are the experts on these things. So that was sort of more fun. And whereas Jerry Harvey's annual meeting the year before, no webcast, no archive, no record of what happened. Whereas this time it's online, you can tape it from home, everyone can see it, the more people can access it. So I'm quite a fan of the online AGM. So what I like about the corporate system in Australia, if anyone ever tells you, if you don't like the governance, you can always sell your shares. That is rubbish for two reasons, because we have compulsory superannuation, which means that every working Australian is exposed to the share market because we have a 55% allocation to equities. And there's so much index investing where you buy the index that everyone is exposed to Harvey Norman, who is exposed through their super fund being with an index fund like BlackRock, State Street or Vanguard, who are the world's three biggest index funds and on average own 15% in every public company in Australia in the top 300. So everyone is exposed to the top 300 by index investing and compulsory super. So it really does matter who's on the board. Are they transparent? Are they being well run? What is the transparency and the governance? So overall, I think our disclosure system is quite good. We get excellent remuneration disclosure and voting on remuneration. We're now even getting some of the big polluters promising to put out climate reports, to have a non-binding vote on their climate policies every year. The likes of Woodside and Santos are doing that. Proxy advisors, I don't know if you've heard of them. These are these people like Ownership Matters and ISS and CGI Glass Lewis. They're paid money by the institutions to advise them how to vote. That's a very good system because the fund managers themselves are too busy to assess all 300 companies, so they outsource the voting advice to these proxy advisors. And in my view, they do a very good job. So I often work with the proxy advisors and I say, you got any bullets I can fire? And they will say, yes, go to this meeting, ask this question, whatever. So they, sometimes we joke about drive-by shootings where, they deliver me the gun and I go and do the drive-by at the AGM. So I can't research everything myself, but you've got to tap into people who do research it, and then you just provide that public rhetorical dressing to put the pressure on, because the proxy advisors never turn up to the meeting, never ask public questions. All their business is backroom stuff. So you try and bring some of their excellent research into the public arena by asking pointed questions, which they've assisted with. I do love the one vote, one value we have in Australia. We don't have any dual class voting systems like the Americans have, which Rupert hides behind. We have no poison pills. It's easy to run for the board. So I've run for 54 boards because you can self-nominate one shareholder. Too easy. Putting up a resolution in Australia is harder. You need 100 signatures for a shareholder resolution. So I've never done a shareholder resolution in Australia, but I have run 54 boards because it's so easy to do it. And that's a good part of our system. There are no barriers to entry for contesting a leadership position in a public company. We've got a good AGM system where you've got to have 28 days notice. Annual reports come out early. And you've got the law guarantees the debate. Unlike in the US, where Murdoch can just have one set of questions for the whole meeting, as opposed to calling for debate on every item of business, like the Australian law requires. ASIC is hopeless, but the class actions regime in Australia, led by Maurice Blackburn, has done a great job in keeping companies honest. A few nice to haves in Australia. I wouldn't mind annual director elections rather than 3 yearly cycles, like the UK system, where shareholders get to vote on any political donations. So political donations by public companies have crashed in the UK since that reform came in 5 years ago. Our public companies are still giving far too much to the political system. We need secret ballots, so we need the AEC running corporate elections, not the companies themselves. If it's good enough for unions, it should be good enough for public companies. And it should be easier for shareholder resolutions. In the US, you need to own $2,000 worth of shares for 12 months, and you can put up an opinion-based resolution. I did that to News Corp in 2007 in New York. In Australia, you need 100 shareholders. And the capital raising system in Australia is too slack. Retail shareholders often get diluted by unfair insider placements to the big end of town. So I'd love to see some reform of Australia's anything goes capital raising system, which does not look after the small shareholder very well at all. Just a few final messages before we go to questions. I think tenure limits and leadership change is very important. There's far too many men clinging on for too long, whether it's Putin, Z, Rupert Murdoch, John Howard, John Setka, you name it, they will stay too long. Men don't like giving up power particularly. So a good system of tenure limits, leadership transition, it's very, very important to have systems that encourage that constant renewal in leadership. I just, as I said, I'm a big believer in transparency. I don't believe that the public company system is unethical or corrupt. I do believe that if the rules allow it, corporates will do anything. So nothing surprises me, from James Hardie poisoning people to any number of scandals. So I do believe you need strong regulation. And this is why, from an ownership point of view, you need really strong shareholder rights to hold companies to account. And a lot of the climate action in Australia is coming from the shareholders rather than the government. I mean, yesterday, AGL had 57% of the shareholders voted that they should have a decent climate report on how they're going to meet Paris by 2030. And the board told the shareholders to vote against it, and the shareholders revolted and voted in favour of that, put up by this Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility, which is an activist group pushing for climate change. So, I think that there's a lot of good things that come, and that nothing would happen with climate change if the regulators didn't insist on it or the shareholders didn't insist on it. Journalism is struggling, and so I'm a big believer in institutionalised transparency to offset the decline in the relative power of journalism. And the best example of that is you can have 100 investigative journalists trying to discover the pay packets of all the CEOs of Australia's top 300 companies, or you can have an automatic system of disclosure that just that makes it legal to publish that information anyway. So I'm a much bigger believer in the disclose everything and allow people to sift and digest an avalanche of information, rather than the old model of disclose nothing and rely on journalists to get documents off the back of a truck or put in FOI requests or ask questions directly, So just get it all out there and get the journalists and the citizen journalists analysing the data. Like, the conversation is fantastic. It's academics writing public sort of commentary pieces, and no journalists to be seen, but it is a form of journalism and commentary, which is really healthy. I do worry about the short-termism of the share market. It remains a systemic problem that too often companies like MIM, or there's been a whole bunch of good performing companies over the year that have been sold too early because the investors have lost patience and someone comes along and makes a bid. I mean, Boral's just sold up all their US assets and come back to being an Australian company. A bit of long-term persistence sometimes. The share market with the share price every day, institutions all competing for percentage points of outperformance. Too often businesses are sold too early, rather than people showing patience and the long-term investing that the likes of Buffett has indicated and demonstrated really does work. And, it is ethical to own shares. Just be active. So if you do choose to own shares, come to the AGM, follow the company, engage with the company, pick your own stocks. So don't own gambling stocks, don't own coal stocks. Pick the right sort of stocks. I love the fact that Australian Ethical, which is a listed investment company, has been one of the best performed companies on the market in the last few years. And there's actually a Greens MP who's a friend of mine, Carolyn Lakuta, who just retired from the ACT Assembly. She was one of the founders of Australian Ethical way, way, way back, and suddenly now finds herself sitting on $35 million worth of stock. And she's like, what do I do with this? I'm a Green. I'm not meant to make money. But she founded Australian Ethical. They only buy ethical stocks. They perform really well. Yes, they're probably overcharged with their fees, like most financial planners and fund managers do. But, they've just done brilliantly well, and they don't go near any coal stocks, gambling. They only invest ethically. So final point before we get to questions is to remember those 4 points about the great leadership, the well-designed system, the maximum transparency, and the ability for all of us to change the system or change the leadership based on the reliable factual information about how both are performing for the community. So I've got a few more points to make, which are not in the PowerPoint, but I might just sort of stop sharing the screen and throw it open to questions, I think, and we can have a bit of a discussion.
Thank you. Could I ask a question to lead us into the interface between something that an amazing individual has reported tonight and what I might call the democratization of shareholder advocacy, whatever the words were that we had? Because Stephen, you've alluded to some groups and maybe some individuals, but I'm trying to get a fuller picture of how you would multiply your effect by cluing others in, other than being, an influence of 4,000 people on whatever, Twitter. What is your strategy? Do you see yourself moving from doing it to teaching it? That's the kind of thing. I think you're with me.
Well, look, I've had two stints with three separate stints with the Shareholders Association. So I've had 2 stints on the board for a total of, I think, 4.5 years, starting in 2010, I think it was. And then I had a 2-year period where I was basically running their engagement and policy. So I did help rewrite all the ASA policies back then, most of which are still intact 8 years later. So I have done the collective thing, although what's happened is I do tend to get a little frustrated with ASA because I think in my view, they are inherently quite conservative and don't want to upset the companies particularly. So they've got 100 volunteers who go out and engage with the companies. And so obviously there's the full continuum of get stuck into them to, love to have a tea and coffee with the chairman, sort of don't upset the chairman type thing. So I've found myself when I've gone inside it's worked for a time, but then I've got a bit frustrated, and in the end I've said, look, I think I'm just better if I can just go out and just be my own person. I have worked with the proxy advisors a little bit, so I do sort of collaborate with them, and I collaborate with a lot of journalists. I mean, I will work with Joe Aston on the Fin Review and other journalists. I work with Four Corners journalists at times to get governance stories up. I've done over 1,000 spots on the ABC talking business. I'll often do I've been on Q&A 5 times, and that often the shareholder stuff comes up. So I have found the most effective way has just been the entirely independent person commenting freely, and 42,000 followers on Twitter. You can, you follow the ASX announcements every day and you pump out tweets. It can be quite influential. Teaching, look, yeah, potentially down the track. But the thing about it is that outside of ASA, who are you teaching on at the governance level? I mean, I'm doing a talk to an MBA class in a few weeks, which is aspiring directors and executives. I do quite a lot of Leadership Victoria training seminars. So I've done probably 300 or 400 speeches over the years. I guess that's an element of teaching. Yeah, but unlike say the union movement, there's 1,300 paid unionists in Australia, whereas how many paid shareholder activists are there? There's not many of us. It's a pretty small cohort. So I think there's potential upside. I mean, I'd love to set up the first ever American Shareholders Association, because I don't even have one. And then out of the same office, you'd set up the International Shareholders Association, because with globalization, all retail shareholder advocacy and activism is local. Most of it is fairly ineffective. The Dutch have got one, the Poms have got one, the Kiwis, but they're all quite similar to the ASA. It tends to be quite elderly, volunteer, and there's only a limited level of effectiveness. So my ultimate dream is to set up the International Shareholders Association to be a dynamic, effective global advocate for good governance and transparency at major global public listed companies. that would be my dream. And with technology and online AGMs, that might be opening up, and then helping to build capacity within the various national shareholders associations.
Okay, thank you. People, please use your show hand if you want to ask a question. Stephen, could you look in chat to see that your namesake, Stephen Stewart, has a question? Stephen Stewart, do you want to articulate this one while we wait for Stephen to answer?
Well, thank you. Very interesting, of course. But the most obvious question that occurs to me is this problem, which I call the conundrum of ethical investing. If you sell out of something that you disapprove of, it'll only go into the hands of people who don't have your scruples, and the company behaviour will not be affected. And this affects, things from gambling to nuclear armaments, or a whole range of things that you might suddenly discover you're investing in. So is there any good guidance on this question from
Well, look,
Stephen Mayne?
the scoundrel already owns the stock, so he's not only waiting to buy yours. And if you look at things like listed investment companies, there's probably 60 of them out there. And the well-regarded ones trade at net assets or a premium to net assets. But the ones that are poorly governed or take too much fees will often trade at a discount to net assets. So ethical investing, the more ethical you are, the more popular you are, the higher your share price will be. So basically it's a capital strike leads to a lower rated share price, a lower multiple of earnings, a higher dividend yield because the stock is lower. And look at AGL. Most of the institutions are out of AGL now. It's now 60% owned by retail, because the big institutions have said, we don't want to own Australia's biggest carbon polluter. And retail have stuck with it. And the share price has gone from $27 to $5.50 in 4 years. And I would argue that's an unethical company, which has been punished by people selling out and is now desperately trying to demerge and transition from coal to renewables, because they're just watching their share price crash because everyone's selling them because they think they're unethical. So I think there is great power in divesting based on an ethical perspective, not much for a single shareholder like you or me, but at the collective level, there's enormous power. And I simply say, don't own something you wouldn't want to, that doesn't let you sleep at night. And the scoundrels already own it. So unless you're going to roll up your sleeves and save it, fix it, go to the AGM and argue for better behaviour, then if I'm ignoring a company because they're bad, I should be going after them. So I feel for me it's an ethical question about going after the bad guys. But I don't think you should feel that you should hang on to your Tabcorp shares just because it won't have any effect of you getting out. You should get out.
Les, would you like to unmute and speak your question?
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Stephen, I got a real insight into your A, life history, and B, all this stuff you get up to. Just building on what you were saying about international governance. From memory, Transparency International Australia is only looking at the transparency of governments. So with that caveat, have you had any relations with Transparency International Australia? And on top of that, is there any reporting metric on governance of businesses? Transparency of businesses, I mean, in Australia?
Look, the proxy advisors do the best work because they do reports on all 300 companies. They rate them for their governance. They make sure they have a majority of independent directors, that everything's transparent, that the auditor's not getting paid too much non-audit fees. So there's not really too many other groups. There's a Responsible Investment Association, but a lot of those groups tend to be climate or environmental. So the Australasian Corporate Centre for Responsibility, they've done a great job putting up all these resolutions in recent years. But at the end of the day, they want to shut down the coal industry. At the end of the day, they are an environmental group. They're not so much into governance or transparency. So there's not many advocates for transparency. I have found that the just ask principle, which is if you just email a company and ask them to do something, it's amazing how, particularly if it's me and it's before the AGM and they're worried I'm going to go to the AGM, it's amazing how they'll just agree to do it. Like, can you please publish a full transcript of this year's AGM? Crown, Woolworths, Transurban, Westfield, Westpac. Yes, we will this year. We'll do it. Can you please put the full audio webcast up, not just your chairman's speech? Okay. So when you disclose the outcome of this share purchase plan offer, can you please say how many shareholders it was sent to and how many applied so we can work out what the participation rate was? And here's my list of other companies that have done that. So you get the precedent and then you ask others to do it. So at the moment, I'm pushing for disclose the proxies before the meeting starts so we can ask questions about any big protest votes and disclose the outcome of the meeting, not just in shares, but in shareholders, because only about 2% of shareholders vote. But the other day at Metcash, for the first time, they agreed on their website to put up the result by shares and shareholders. And so 98% of the shares were voted in favour of the remuneration report, but 458 of the 871 shareholders who voted against. So the retail shareholders voted against. So if we want to energise retail participation in voting, disclose to the public how the retail shareholders are voting, i.e. reveal the results by shareholder and shares, and you will energise and drive retail participation because we'll be able to see the results and say to the board, well, yes, you got 97%, but you still had 600 shareholders who voted against. So we're concerned about your pay. So that's probably not really on topic. There's probably not enough benchmarking and overall assessments of our system and our transparency. And I don't know the Transparency International people very well because you're right, they only look at governments. But they do good work. I do like their work.
Thanks, Stephen.
Stephen Hickson, we've got 3 Stephens tonight.
Okay, I'll just go a little bit of an opinion that I regard superannuation in forced saving as a type of theft. It's simply taking away money from often very poor people and giving it to the financial system. That's my view on it, and I'll ask you how you would reflect on that question yourself. And the other question is about gambling. I'm rather opposed to this whole culture of gambling. I know it has its pleasant looking sides, but I think it's just a horribly destructive thing to families. So I was wondering what you'd have to say there, Steve.
Sure. Well, we have a uniquely paternalistic superannuation system where every single working Australian is forced to have 10% of their salary paid as effectively as a tax on the company, paid by the company into their super. And then this has created a wall of capital, which is one of the reasons why our share market has gone up so much, why our banks are so valuable. Because back in the day, this prime savings tool of Australians was their house. Buy a house, pay off the mortgage, tax-free. Now, we're the most indebted householders in the world with our mortgages, but we have a similar amount of money set aside in super. So all super has achieved is a massive churn for the banks who clip the ticket on super and clip the ticket on mortgages, which is why Commonwealth Bank share price has gone through $100 today, and our big banks are worth close to 400 billion and the most lucrative banks in the world, because I think it's mainly because of this super system, which has just created this massive churn. Have we really saved much at all as a nation if we've just hugely mortgaged our houses and got a similar amount in super for when we retire? It has been great for building businesses, floating businesses, because it has provided capital that wasn't there before. But I do agree that the fees are too expensive, but I do like the industry fund model, and the industry funds
I might just add, it's a funny thing where you borrow your own money back to buy your own house.
Yeah, effectively, yeah. So, and it was interesting how many people accessed their super early, last year during COVID. I mean, it was like 50 billion people hopping into it. So it is a bit strange to make a 19-year-old put money away in super when they're 65. But now, look, on gambling, I did a couple of years working for the Alliance for Gambling Reform. Australians lose 25 billion a year on gambling, which is 40% world's worst in per capita terms, $1,000 for every Australian, 40% worse than the second highest country, which is, depending on the measure, it's either Hong Kong or Singapore. And much of their gambling is tourism. So 14 billion a year on the pokies, 5,000 pokies venues, world's most addictive and dangerous and high-intensity poker machines, ridiculous unlimited foreign bookmakers, sports betting, gambling advertising on television, all hours of the day. It's like Bermuda. They're all registered in the Northern Territory, paying no tax. All the sports bets and the Bet365s. And the casinos, I'm just glad to see James Packer come a cropper. Why have we got a casino in Melbourne that's twice as big as the biggest casino in Las Vegas? Thank you, Jeff Kennett, but we didn't really need it. So it's just a travesty. The Labor Party historically is far more to blame. I mean, Labor Party actually takes about 50 million a year off gamblers themselves. They've got 6 venues, poker machine venues owned by the Labor Party, 4 in Canberra, and then the Randwick Labor Club. So there's no other political party in the world that runs gambling dens as part of their fundraising operations, but that's how entrenched it is in Australia. And compare it to smoking. We've got the lowest smoking rate in the world. No director will go and serve on a cigarette company, but the great and the good will happily go and join the Crown Board, from Helen Coonan to Ziggy Switkowski to Harold Mitchell. So we've got to make gambling like tobacco, just absolutely a stench that no one will be associated with. But they're so scary, they're so powerful, they're so cashed up, they do so many big donations and they hire so many politicians that it's incredibly entrenched and it's difficult to tackle. And I won't be happy until the total spend on gambling is down from 25 billion to 10 billion a year. That'll be about right for Australia.
Thank you.
Well, you've got a very attentive audience, Stephen.
I had another couple of minor points I was going to throw in.
Go with your material.
One of them was, how do you pay for all this? I often get asked that. How do you run around, be a shareholder activist? How do you pay for it? Now, I have had a bit of a windfall from capital raisings. So if you own tiny shares in 400 companies, from time to time, they will do a share purchase plan, or they will do a non-renounceable offer where you can apply for additional shares. So since 2007, I've made about 400,000 just playing the margins of capital raisings. So that's to sort of say that, arguing that companies should offer all shareholders a share purchase plan where everyone gets a chance to buy $30,000 worth of new shares. Now, the fact that I'm the tallest and the smallest shareholder in most companies at 6'6" and 10 shares, I sometimes get offered a chance to buy 30,000 shares just like anyone else. And you often get scaled back, but you can make a bit of money out of it. So when I bought all these shares, I didn't think about this, but it has turned out to self-fund in a sense. So the more tiny shareholdings you buy, the more capital raising opportunities you get, and you can pick and choose. And I always just sell on the first day because I can't afford to hold the stock, but I have been able to make a bit of money churning it. Another great thing is that the ACCR, the Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility, and Market Forces have pioneered in the last 5 years putting up shareholder resolutions. And they've done this because they've got electronic signatures. So you need 100 signatures from shareholders to put a resolution up at an annual meeting. And they've now got a database, and they just email their database and say, can we use your electronic signature? And bang, away they go. So they have changed the face of shareholder resolutions in the last 5 years. And what they do is, in Australia, you can't put up an opinion-based resolution. You can't say, we want you to do more on climate change, because the law says that that's for the directors and you can't put up opinions. But in America, you can put up non-binding opinion resolutions all the time. So what the ACCR and Market Forces do, Market Forces is an offshoot of Friends of the Earth, so the green activist groups, is they put up a constitutional amendment to change the constitution of the company so you can have opinion-based resolutions. And then at the same meeting, they put up a contingent resolution, which says if the constitution is changed, we therefore put up this opinion about modern slavery or climate change or offshore detention or whatever it might be. And so all these companies have to go to the vote, and they reveal the vote even though the resolution is never formally put, because the constitutional change is always defeated. But we still have the debate and the vote on the contingent resolution, which is expressing an opinion. So it's been a very clever reform by these two groups. I'm really keen to get them into the gambling space to start doing a few resolutions about gambling, but they've made a big impact. And the other thing I was going to say is that Australia has a unique ability, unlike any other country in the world, to ask auditors questions. The auditor has to be available to answer questions at the AGM. Shareholders can write to the auditor, and the auditor must write back to the shareholder. No one has ever systematically used this, a campaign of letters to the auditor. I try and get them up at the AGMs from time to time, but it is a unique ability that no other jurisdiction offers this. And it's just one of the overall good suite of governance transparency measures available in Australia. We don't have everything. For instance, a classic thing we don't have is that when you get a merger between two companies, one might be worth 60%, one might be worth 40%. In countries like South Africa, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the UK, both sets of shareholders would get to vote on that. But in Australia, only the company being bought gets to vote. So that's why a lot of Australian companies go over the top and lose money paying too much in a takeover, because they don't have the discipline of seeking shareholder approval before they go and spend $2 billion. And the best example of that was Slater and Gordon, the listed law firm, world's first listed law firm, got up to being worth $2 billion, paid $1.3 billion in cash for this UK business called Quindell, which was probably worth $100 million. They paid $1.3 billion in cash, and they could do that overnight without putting a vote to the shareholders and said, do you want to spend $1.3 billion buying this thing in the UK? So the transactions industry opposes acquiring companies a vote, because a lot of deals wouldn't go through, because it would put a discipline on companies to not overpay. And whenever you get a 50-50 merger, you'll always notice that they cynically get whichever company is paying too much or giving too much away. Surprise, surprise, they don't get the vote. And the people, so they're quite cynical the way they do that. So that's another little shareholder power thing I would love to see introduced in Australia. But overall, we should be very happy, and we're quite lucky with our governance system. We need more diversity in the directors club. There's still too many male, pale and stale directors, but long serving is working. There's most directors, when they get to 12 years, they're gone. So we're not getting the 20-year veterans, which is a good system. And the US don't even have majority of independent directors. They have executive chairs. Whereas we have a very stringent model of, you should always have an independent chair and a majority of independent directors. And not every country has that. To independent directors, you can't be part, there's only one manager on the board, and the rest are non-executive independent directors who are answerable to the shareholders. So I think that's a good system as well. So overall, we've got a good system. We just need to get the right people on the right boards. And I'd love, chairman selection is a real secret boards business. I'd love one day to have the ASA invited in and consulted on for chairman selection, because at the moment it's just entirely secret board business. And I don't see why shareholders shouldn't be consulted on who the next chairman is going to be, because chairs are very powerful. They're the boss of the CEO effectively. The CEO is the most important person in the company. the chairman is the second most important person, and we really need to get the right people in those roles to maximise performance at public companies. I think Jenny's got a raised hand.
So you have, Jenny.
You've sort of urged me to inquire. I'm curious as to whether, if the cards fell in the right way, which board you would like to be on, if you would, at this time. Do you think that there are certain moves, certain opportunities that you would envisage where you could have an effective role, Stephen?
Look, I think my most effective role would be in a governance turnaround situation. So if I got onto the Harvey Norman board, I would say, let's stop running fake franchisees and to dodge $25 million a year in payroll tax by pretending these fake franchisees are not just employees of the company, even though we sweep their bank account every night. So let's just normalise it and be like JB Hi-Fi and Woolworths and just have thousands of employees and pay the payroll tax. And then let's have more independent directors. Let's not have the most inaccurate accounts. Let's consolidate the franchisees and let's disclose our property holdings. We can't just claim we've got $3 billion of properties and not tell the community or our shareholders where these properties are. So I think I'd be there. If I look at what happened in the City of Melbourne, I'm quite strong on the, hiring the CEO, good process, getting the turnover, removing dodgy directors, catching out the crooked people. So yeah, I think turnaround situations, maybe media. I mean, I think I could be quite helpful as a Crown director because I certainly know anything which you've got to know a political process, media. But yeah, I think, I don't know. I'm not a good long-term person. I get bored easily. So I'd love to be a turnaround, where you're needing new independent directors to hold management to account. That would be my sort of role after you've been through a scandal and you've got to restore trust and credibility and transparency in the market and admit to your mistakes. So admitting to your mistakes is something that many boards don't do. And so often, I've got a list of this one. It's called the new CEO write-offs list. So as soon as you appoint a new CEO, all of a sudden they discover that everything's terrible and they declare $1 billion loss in their first year. And that, of course, means that in all future years, they'll have bigger profits because they'll have less depreciation, amortization, and write-downs. And they make the last person look like a dill. Now, how those directors who sat there for years claiming the assets were worth something, and then just because the CEO changed, they suddenly think it's worth $1 billion less. That is where the directors have failed. And so the directors never take the hard medicine on mistakes until after they've sacked the CEO. So I think a really good director will actually force the write down when it's apparent, even if it embarrasses the CEO for having done a stupid takeover at some point.
Well, good. We've had an hour, nearly an hour and a half. And if that's our commitment to each other and what Stephen shared, it's been very worthwhile. So, Jenny, would you like to make some remarks?
Yes, I'd be delighted to, because it's really been a wonderful opportunity to get your insights into this area, Stephen. And, I think it's been a courageous journey in some ways, and it's been obviously very creative. And I think we've all learned a great deal. So I sort of see you as a bit of a larrikin crusader. I don't know if that sort of sits well with you. But, in this day and age, well, maybe I speak for myself, but it's disheartening to see the direction that democracy appears to be going in terms of politics. And, one hopes to kind of have some way of having some input to have an impact on that. But here's another direction that has opened up for us tonight about how, if we had a few clues and some energy and knew how to do it, we could take another turn to be more active in terms of shaping our world, because we're, as you say, we've all got a stake in this. We've all got superannuation, and so it's been wonderful to get the opportunity to hear your insights into this. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Jenny. It's been a lot of fun, and I've enjoyed the questions and the discussion, and I really appreciate the opportunity. And I think I mentioned to Paul, I wouldn't mind getting paid in the form of a free membership of the Humanists.
Right. Oh, we'd be delighted.
For a year, perhaps.
Oh, no, we thought if you could bear it. We know that you get bored easily, but we'd offer it to you for more than a year if you would like.
I'll take 2 years. That's excellent.
Okay.
Would you like to stand for the board, Stephen?
No, I've still got one kid doing VC this year and one next year, so we've got a bit on. I've still got 3 kids, so yeah, pretty busy, and I'm a bit too disorganised to be a constructive.
No, it's all right. I just thought you're all about getting onto boards. That might be another opportunity.
Yes, no, well, I was chairman of the local kindergarten for a bit, but I wasn't a very good kindergarten chair. So even with running for mayor, people say, "Why aren't you running for mayor?" I say, "Well, I don't particularly like all the meet and greet. I'd much rather be the contradictor in the back of the room." So yeah, I like to sort of just stir them up, and I think you guys don't need any stirring up. You're going along quite nicely from what I understand. So I just love to be an ordinary member and participate in your program.
Could you, if it's useful, send to me maybe for everyone some links to key groups you've mentioned tonight where we may want to follow and even support some activism to which you've referred, and get on your coattails, and your tweet for those who would like to, knowing that they can always delete it next week if they don't like so many messages every day.
Yeah.
So thank you, Stephen, personally from me and from everybody, and to everyone.